Hi, welcome to Rev'd Up for Sunday, a lectionary podcast from the clergy of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut. I'm Justin Crisp.
I'm Elizabeth Garnsey.
And I'm Peter Walsh.
And today we're looking at the gospel lesson appointed for Good Friday. This is the story of the Passion of our Lord Jesus Christ according to the Gospel of St. John. It's an incredible story, full of nuance, full of depth, full of tragedy, violence, redemption, and beauty. In this gospel, Jesus' last words are, "It is finished." The truth is, it was only the beginning. Because of the length of this gospel lesson, we're not actually going to read the gospel in its entirety here at the beginning of the podcast, as is our custom. We're just going to launch in. If you would like to take a moment to look up the gospel for yourself, the lectionary appoints John chapter 18, verse 1 through chapter 19, verse 42. This thing is so rich. Where should we start?
Well, I'll give us an entrance in. So this is really revved up for Friday.
That's right.
This is not really revved up for Sunday, and it even begins on Thursday.
Yep.
So revved up for Thursday night and Good Friday. I'll just walk us into the door because, as you said, it's so rich that's just you don't know where to begin. We could have this podcast go for about 7 or 8 hours if you've all got the time. But why don't we just simply start with the voicing in this? You had talked about this narrative being different than the ones in the Synoptic Gospels, each of which has their own characterization of what happened and how it unfolded. And just to say, the voicing of Jesus in this is that Jesus on the cross here, that Jesus is almost as though the ascended Jesus is speaking through the earthly Jesus. We have a very, very high theology where Jesus is always in control and always in power. And the second, let's just walk in the door, is John's understanding that in the crucifixion, Jesus is not a victim, and that his glorification, his return to the Father, is one movement of crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. And so now we start in on the story of this upward movement from to the Father from whom he came. So that's just as an opening shot. And Elizabeth, why don't you just bring us a little bit deeper into the text here?
Yeah, okay. Well, John, as we know, is the latest account we have. It's probably decades later than Matthew, Mark, or Luke, certainly decades later than Mark. And so we have much more distance from the actual events, and we have a gospeler who has a more formal theology of who Jesus was, and the church has developed this high Christology, that Jesus in John appears to know more all along and have this sort of heightened calm of knowing everything that's happening before it happens, and a full understanding of why it's happening, and literally embodying God with full knowledge that he's embodying God, and calmly walking through this very violent death at the hands of humans. Yeah. So I like to factor that into this account of John. And I do want to claim that Jesus is a victim, and that he knows he's a victim, and he knows why he's a victim in John. And he probably, in all the Gospels you could say he's a victim. But for my sense of what the cross is about and why it's changes everything, and why we mark it so solemnly and so deliberately every Holy Week and all in our lives together, is that Jesus was a victim, and he exposes how this violent act towards him kind of shows how empty our human violence is, and leads us into a new way of being.
You agree with that?
So I think that is, I think that's part of it. I think the unveiling of the emptiness of human violence, the unveiling of the futility of the attempt to effect redemption through violent means, that's certainly part of what's going on in the gospel. I think in what's happening in the crucifixion. I think that on top of that unveiling of the futility of violence to attain redemption, you have God working in a way that I think God works repeatedly in history, which is to take an act of deep tragedy, misfortune, disaster, catastrophe, etc., and to turn it into a mechanism for good. So I tend to think that historically Jesus died for all of the reasons that you shared, Elizabeth. Jesus dies an unjustly executed political criminal. The Romans reserved crucifixion for a particular kind of criminal. They didn't just crucify people who were thieves or anything like that. They crucified people whom they needed to execute publicly as a warning to others not to threaten the order of things in the empire. So Jesus is executed here. I take it he's executed historically because he's accused of positioning himself over against the emperor. They execute him as a potential revolutionary. Anyway, we could talk about that later on. That's the historical bit, right? And so there's an unveiling of the fact that you can't kill this stuff off and expect for that to be redemptive. Violence is never going to actually accomplish human flourishing. And at the same time, I think that God takes this disaster, this catastrophe, and uses it as a means by which to reconcile God with the world. Not in the sense that, I know it's very common to have what's known as an atonement theology. Atonement is just a word that means reconciliation, really, is what it means. At-one-ment, it means the at-one-ment of humanity and God, or the at-one-ment of us with each other, right? We can atone for things. If we've wronged another person, we can make an act of atonement. We can apologize. We can try to repair our relationship with the person, etc. So there are atonement theologies which take what happens on the cross and they say that God requires Jesus to suffer the punishment which is really due everybody else, all humankind, by virtue of their sin. God requires that punishment to be taken by somebody, and so requires his son to take that punishment. And that turns God into a kind of cosmic psychopath. You would think that God could just break God's rules, as it were. If God is really God, then why would God go to such lengths to say, yeah, okay, so somebody's got to pay the price. I guess I'm going to pay the price, right? In the second person of the Trinity, I'm going to send my son to suffer this punishment. I don't really buy that as an incredibly convincing understanding of the atonement, but I don't think that it gets rid of all atonement theology altogether. I think there's something that happens in the cross which, in the light of the resurrection, the church can see, and so it begins to be reflected in different images they use for the cross in Scripture, the chiefest of which is a sacrifice, which according to the Jewish ritual codes, the sacrifice was the way in which the Jewish people atoned for things. It was one of the ways that they atoned for, atonement was one of the purposes of sacrifices, so that they could maintain their relationship with God across wrongdoing, across sin, across brokenness, etc., and that they interpret this as one final, ultimate sacrifice, which makes right God's relationship with the whole world. And I think that's happening on top of the historical reality, in which the futility of these earthly powers to, redeem via violence or accomplish human flourishing, secure human flourishing via violence, are seen to be futile.
No, wow. Holy smokes.
Trying to have my cake and eat it too.
Well,
so to agree with what Elizabeth is saying, and then to say there's a spiritual dimension on top of it that we call atonement.
Well, I don't agree with Elizabeth.
Uh-oh.
Not in this case.
I agree. Said everything.
I agree totally on. So I see it differently. You guys have gone really into deep places here, but I think that the four gospel narratives are like a symphony, and if you took this out, it would be like taking out the woodwinds or something like that. You'd be taking one portion of the sound of it out, and that this portion of the symphony plays a different set of notes than some of the other gospel symphonies, and that you emphasized on a syllable, some of the other ones. But here in John's gospel, I think what John's giving us is that Jesus is decidedly not a victim. He's never a victim. And so when he's at the Garden of Gethsemane and the detachment comes out And, Peter slices off the ear and he heals the ear. And he meets him and he says, am I not to drink the cup the Father has given me? So this is a transaction between Jesus and the Father, and that everybody else is a player on a stage, but they have no power over him. And so then when he comes forward here and he goes to see Annas, and you get like there's more than one high priest here, and we can get into that later about why that's the case here. And he said, I didn't say anything in secret, so like nothing you're going to do is going to hurt me here. They bring him out to scourge him, and the scourging was done not just to beat prisoners, it was so that they would confess. And it wasn't just flogged. This is where they would put bits of glass and stone in this, and people would they would do this 39 times to get them to confess. He's got nothing to confess. And then before he's with Pilate, and there's the whole reversal of things, right? So Pilate thinks he's interviewing Jesus, but Jesus is interviewing Pilate. It's Pilate who's on Pilate's on trial, not Jesus. And he says, you have no power over me unless it was given you from above. So at every turn, everybody who tries to have power over Jesus, they don't have any power over him. Pilate has no power over him. And the times he doesn't respond, and Pilate's crazed, right? Do you not know I have the power to crucify you? And you don't have any power over me. And then even at the end of Jesus' last words on the cross, when he says, it's finished, I'm taking my own life. I'm done. And when he says it's finished, this, what you're talking about, is done. But he gets it done before they break his legs, right? They break everyone's legs. And the soldiers are surprised that he's already died. He gives up his own life at his own volition. It's in John's gospel, I simply don't believe that it's taken away from him. I think these are all movers on the stage, but he is never a victim. He never gives up control. In this one, which he does, in Mark's gospel, he's straight up a victim. He's straight up a victim of all the stuff you're talking about. I would agree with that, but I don't agree with it in this one.
Yeah,
I think that's a well-made case. I mean, you and I are saying the word victim, but meaning something different, I think. And I agree that no one has power over Jesus, and he walks fearlessly into his death, and he doesn't resist. He doesn't shrink in fear. He doesn't defend himself. Right, he's completely on top of it. But, and that's his self-knowledge and self-awareness and his embodiment of God and knowing death has no hold over him. But to be a victim, I don't think he has to be those other things like shrinking in fear and afraid and all that. And he's not those things in the other Gospels either. But he's a victim of human violence, just in fact. He is nailed to the cross.
Yeah, straight up true.
And he doesn't nail himself to the cross. Right. And so by victim, I mean he takes the place of the victim innocently. He assumes that role, and what he gives us and what he gives his disciples in the resurrection is coming back as a victim who forgives and who comes in peace and who, they don't understand any of this until the resurrection. And I think that they can tell the story this way. John can tell the story this way because they've experienced resurrection, and now they see everything Jesus did, said, taught, walked in light of the resurrection.
Yeah, I agree with
so
that.
The resurrection changes everything. It changes their whole idea of what it means that Jesus was a sacrifice. And that whole language developed later. I think that they couldn't use that language until they really understood what Jesus was doing. And in Mark, what we don't have in John are things like the dramatic ripping of the temple curtain, and that this language of Jesus dying for our sins, as a sacrifice was so anti-temple, like a very subversive way of framing what Jesus did, because no longer did you need to go to the temple and make your sacrifice in order to have access to God or to have forgiveness. And Jesus comes back in forgiveness, teaching a whole new way, or they understood him to always have been teaching a different way and always to be on the side of the victims, that the system, the oppressive or dominating system would victimize. and James Allison, or many of these so-called Girardian theologians that I follow and I appreciate so much, they would say that Jesus had the intelligence of the victim. He had the perspective of the victim.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
But from the beginning, and they couldn't understand it. The disciples couldn't understand it. We couldn't understand it until resurrection had occurred. And so Jesus, they didn't understand him all along. They're like, what are you doing? Like, not resisting. What are you doing defending these lawbreakers? And the Pharisees thought, why are you eating with sinners? Breaking laws, displeasing God and our way. He always had the perspective of a victim, and he could expose their side of the story. And so the Girardian school would say that all of human culture and society is founded upon sacred violence, making victims, finding scapegoats, shutting out some common enemy so that we can feel meaning. So,
wow.
That's what I mean by victim. And I'm with you, Peter. Yeah. I really do agree that in John, Jesus has that composure that's just so aware. So he's not victimized, but he takes that role.
So I still want to say that you're both right, and I'm not trying to say that because I'm trying to get out of having to take a side, but because I read the Gospel of John almost throughout as being an apocalypsis or an unveiling, and that what John is doing is John's pulling back the curtain on the spiritual dimension of things, which has been happening all along, and the epistemology or the understanding of knowledge that the Gospel of John assumes is that this gospel is not. So the goal of John is not to do what Luke's gospel is. Luke's goal is to provide an orderly account to Theophilus, either any lover of God or this particular dude named Theophilus, right? John's goal is to facilitate an encounter with the living word, the Logos, whose story is portrayed here in and through the reading of this gospel. So the reading of the Gospel of John, I think the author's intent of the reading of the Gospel of John is supposed to facilitate a meeting with the living Christ, with the Logos. And that goes back to my reading of the prologue, the first chapter of John, etc. And so here you're getting, this is what's happening even though nobody knew. This is part of what's true. Like it's not that these are two things in competition with one another. You have an historical reality, and then you have what God is doing with it. And actually, I really, really love that, because I do agree with the Girardian people that human violence is never redemptive. But there's so much human violence. I want for God to do something with it. I don't want for God to just leave it meaningless. And this is a story of God taking some human violence, which in and of itself was meaningless, and turning it into the means by which God redeemed the world. And I like to think that God could do that with all of our violence and all of our suffering too in the fullness of time. And I think it's interesting that I totally agree. The disciples don't know what's going on here, except after the reresurrection. They only see it in retrospect, which I'll just say, in my experience, that's the only way that I most often know that God is at work too. When I'm going through it, I don't know what's going on. At least I don't know the fullness of it. But in retrospect, right? In prayer, in retrospect, I can see things in the light, in a new light. Speaking of things which God would have to turn around in really incredible ways, I am so moved every time that I read it by Simon Peter's denial of Jesus. And I wonder what you all make of it and what's going on here, right? It's a denial, the threefold denial, which is going to be undone with the threefold, do you love me, do you love me, do you love me, kind of moment. What do you make it? It's an incredibly human moment, right? And John's still human, even though John is incredibly spiritual and mystical, right? And that's just such a human moment.
Yeah, I have no problem with Peter's denial.
None.
Zero.
And what, do you just understand where he's coming from?
Just say, welcome to the human condition. I mean, I think that anybody who has a problem with Peter's denials hasn't really either lived long enough to understand the ambiguities of their own lives, or has a misshapen understanding of their super righteousness. And I would say that holiness is not a superabundance of grace at all times. It is that, but it's combined with a deep sense of the clay-footedness of our humanities. And if you've ever been in a life and death circumstance, man, I do not know the guy. Sounds completely reasonable to me. And I think that the story is not over with Peter. I mean, my favorite passage in the whole scriptures is the undoing of Peter's three denials at the resurrection scene in the final chapter. And then Jesus says to him, after he undoes it, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Feed my sheep, tend my lambs, feed my sheep. And then he says, they're going to put a leather belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go. Peter goes to a lot of places he doesn't wish to go later, but that's not his time. For everything there's a season, for everything there's a moment. And this is not Peter's moment to be a superstar, okay, to be something. So I have zero problem with Peter's denials. None. And those of you who've been to the Church of Gallicantu in the Holy Land, you've seen the sculptures, the three sculptures of Peter's denials. And whoever that sculptor is should be lauded forever because you can see it on Peter's face. You see fear. I mean, there is fear. He is denying, and you see the fire, the whole bit. You can just feel it. So anyway, my take on it is my namesake's. He's still cool with me.
Yeah. Well, Peter takes the heat for a lot of things. I mean, only in John is Peter named as the one that cuts off the ear of the soldier, and the other Gospels say one of the disciples, and I bet here Peter is cast in this role, but who knows, he wasn't alone. None of them stood up for Jesus and said, I was one of his disciples.
Right.
I'll stand by you, Jesus. None of them
You're
did.
my guy.
And so it's an iconic, but I love that undoing. And we have talked at length about Judas in the last 2 episodes, but Peter does what Judas doesn't, which is stick around for the resurrection and get, he's allowed to experience that undoing in this life. And that's a testimony for all of us, that we're never too far gone. And so I love it too. I think that's one of the most wonderful features of John's gospel. I did want to say a word in response to what you said.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
Violence, we ascribe meaning, or we want meaning to come out of all the violence in the world. And with Jesus, the violence against Jesus, we call it redemptive and everything, but I think that the way we see the cross is only redemptive if it's the end of it. To repeat the process again and again and say all violence can have meaning if God, you're not saying this, I'm just saying if we see
that.
how well, we never want it to come to nothing. We want some good to come out of all the bad in the world. But I think that to see a magic or like a divine purpose in violence is to misconstrue the meaning, and for all the meanings we've heaped upon the cross, all the atonement theologies, all those things, soteriologies that require God's, right, to have a victim, blood, sacrifice, they are just one and the same with pagan violence or human sacrifice or just all these things that history is filled and littered with. Unless Jesus's death puts an end to at least our acceptance of violence against one another, we cannot change. It's just a repeated pattern over and over and over. And I think what Jesus does is expose that mechanism and exposes our need to keep committing violence in order to solve our problems. And so, it's a radical because for 2,000 years, Christians have wanted to say God required this violence and that's how we save the world.
I can't make sense out of that.
Right? But it's very upside down. And so when Christians started talking about Jesus' sacrifice being the final sacrifice or the ultimate sacrifice to save us from our sins, because they were subverting that temple idea that you needed the temple, you needed to go to the temple to make your sacrifice and to have access to God. That's in Mark where the temple's curtain is torn in two, and the idea is that we have direct access to God. Like Jesus brings us God, the incarnation fills the world, and And the beginning of John is that. The word comes into the world and the darkness cannot overcome it. And but then within 400 years, the church is saying, no, you have to come to our church. You have to believe in this and that. And you can only have access to God through us. Like, how is that different than the temple that it all subverted? That temple system, and so that's where I feel like even the church, especially the church, can get it wrong when we say this is all required in order to have access to God.
So it's really, really interesting. The case that you're making is incredibly strong. I keep a lot more of the sacrificial theology, I think, than I'm hearing you. And I also have, I think I have more sympathy with the concern that generated it than potentially more so than either of you. I disagree. I do think that penal substitutionary atonement, right? The idea that Jesus is suffering a punishment on behalf of all these other people who God wants to punish, but needs to punish somebody, so God punishes Jesus instead of us. I do think that makes God into a cosmic psychopath. But that's not the only form of atonement theology. I think atonement theology is trying at its heart to square a circle, which is justice and love. We're taught that God is merciful and also that God is just. And how not to just let evil off the hook, but also to have a God of forgiveness is actually not totally clear. So like Anselm, his theory of satisfaction, Anselm doesn't think that God that it's God's fault that evil needs to have some kind of solution to it, that it needs to be repaired. Rather, Anselm thinks there's a certain kind of orderliness to the universe, and you have to do something with the fact there's so much bad and there's so much evil and wrongdoing in it. And so what Jesus does is Jesus resets the scales of that. Jesus repairs the order in a very complicated way, which trades on medieval understandings of honor and that kind of thing. I don't want to go into that, but for Anselm, it's not God who wants to punish somebody or needs to punish somebody. It's that justice requires some kind of remedy, some kind of repair. And even if I don't find every jot and tittle of Anselm's solution to be persuasive, I'm still persuaded by the idea that justice and love need to be squared with one another, and that something about the fact that in this historical happening, Jesus is both the priest and the victim in this sacrifice. That relationship is being repaired spiritually, that we're being reconciled spiritually in a way that does not subvert or negate the ends of justice, but in somehow actually meets them and fulfills them. And I also just think that I'm totally hearing you about like pagan sacrifices and that kind of thing, but even the Jewish sacrifices, so you kill a goat, right? If it's an animal sacrifice and you're going to kill the goat or the lamb, it's not the death itself that made the sacrifice work. The sacrifices, the Levitical law conceives of these sacrifices as gifts made to God. And just as, if I offend one of you, like in this podcast, if I offend one of you, I might buy you a nice coffee cup, or I might bring coffee to you to work to try and apologize, right?
Chai latte. I mean, I'm not
you want chai latte? Yeah, okay. He wants tea. And I think in a similar way, that's what they conceived of sacrifices as gifts, and the way that they gave a gift to God was to slaughter the animal, and then the animal could no longer be used by them, although after the animal was slaughtered, they were permitted to eat the animal and that kind of thing. But it's not the death, it's not actually the violence as such that is redemptive in the sacrificial system for the ancient religion of Judaism. It was the gift character of it. And so what we see here is Jesus is like the final gift, which makes the repeated gift giving unnecessary. It's as though God is like, okay, you don't need to buy me any more coffees here. This is the only one that I ever need you to buy me ever again. That's just continuing our good faith debate around the atonement. And just to say, the scriptures contain all of these descriptions, right? I think you could defend using different parts of the New Testament, all these different readings of what Jesus' death means, and the plurality of these images in the New Testament for what Jesus' death means, I think ought to keep any of us from saying we've got all the right answers.
Oh, absolutely. I think there are many, many ways to understand the cross.
Yeah.
But none of them can be separated from the resurrection.
Completely agree.
And forgiveness. So, I mean, I like to think that God would have preferred not to have this gift that God would have preferred that the world see the light while the light is in the world and embrace it and reform like Nineveh, you know? Anyway.
That's a really interesting thought.
Thanks for hanging in here. I just want to claim that you are super holy-hearted. You are, and that your reading of this goes through the pain of the world in violence. And totally. I just want to claim that you're completely holy-headedness, that your thoughtfulness is PhD in theology from Yale-ness, right? Okay, so you've moved into atonement, you've moved into pain, and I'm just a simpleton with a small coffee cup that's got water in it. And I'm just going to bring us back for a moment to the story here a little bit as we finish up here, and say that I've learned tremendously from and am touched by each and both of you. But just to say that in the scriptures that perhaps you'll take a look at. I read the scriptures here not primarily in either of the venues that you're talking about here. I read this as a story about who is Jesus, and that the purpose of the story is to believe, which is John's version of faith, right? He doesn't say have faith, he says believe. And so when we, as we're going to be reading it on Good Friday, we come down, through the Kidron Valley and into the Garden of Gethsemane there, and we have them coming out and they're looking, whom are you looking for? And Jesus of Nazareth says, I am. So we have the whole I amness thing and then the greatest scene here is when he says, I am. It says Judas who betrayed him was standing with him. And when Jesus said, I am, the he thing, just forget about that he thing. That's an editorial thing. He says, I am. And they step back and fell to the ground. So we have a scene here identifying who Jesus is. They fall down in front of them and he steps forward, has to heal Peter's, Malchus. I love that they named the slave whose ear has been cut off. And then he says, the Father. I'm doing this in communion with the Father. And so, and then they back to the violence thing. They take him to Annas. And Annas and Caiaphas. Annas was the godfather. He was the one who was essentially divvying out who was going to be. All five of his sons were chief priests at one point, and now he's got his son-in-law Caiaphas in there, right? And so they go to Annas, so Annas is really the man, even though Caiaphas gets kind of hung with this, but it's really Annas is the power behind the throne here. And you notice that they have soldiers. So this story actually has that they have Roman soldiers too. The others just have the police, the temple police, and they say they bring an officer. And they bring them they all live together, right? So at Caiaphas' house, Annas is also Annas' house. They live, this is how families live. They live in compound. It's not like I live on one street and my uncle's over on the other street. They all live together. This is why you can't sell land in this world. This is generational land. And then we get slipped in here. Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. Okay, so whoa, amigos. Now we have another disciple who is never talked about in the other ones. Yeah. Right. And since that disciple was known to the high priest, that's the other disciple, not Peter. Peter's a lowly guy. The other disciple is clearly not lowly because he's known to Annas. And so he gets into the courtyard. And then later we hear he goes out and gets Peter in the courtyard. So, not anybody can walk into the high priest's courtyard here. Yeah. And then, then we have what we just described here, the beginning of Peter's first denial, and then Peter before Annas, and Annas is like, asking these questions, and Jesus just says, hey, I've been telling everybody this stuff openly. Why are you asking me these questions? Ask them. And then he gets struck back to the violence. He gets struck on the face. There's no trial before the Sanhedrin here.
Not in John.
Major piece, not even in the drama, right? And then we get Peter, the other denials, the cock crows, and now we're into Friday morning. And at Pilate's headquarters, it's early in the morning. They don't want to enter, and we have Pilate at Antonio's fortress, which is right next to the Temple Mount, and there's a courtyard. And so this whole thing happens in a courtyard where Pilate goes inside, outside, the people in the courtyard. And there's a thing there, called the judgment seat. And today, Antonio's fort has been knocked down. And there's a Franciscan friary there, and there's two churches there. One is the Church of the Judgment, and the other is the Church of the Holy Flagellation, which I think is a funny name, if you don't mind my saying for it.
Definitely want to join the altar, go to that church.
It's for an event for that, and it's these are the first two stations of the way of the cross here as they're walked in Jerusalem. but we get here, the whole question, are you the king of the Jews, right? Like this. And so we have this whole conversation about king and kingdom, and you say that I'm a king, and then truth, and then Pilate turning away. What is truth? I mean, the one guy in the world can tell him the truth. And so what do we have here? We have Jesus as the kingdom of God. We get Jesus as the truth incarnate, right? And then Pilate going back and forth with the crowd, and they release Barabbas, and then they scourge him and they beat him and they put a purple robe on him and they hail him as king, and that whole thing, the irony of all that. So again, it's who is Jesus? And then, Pilate back at the Praetorium, the Antonius fortress, going in and out, and this question of power, where he says, Pilate says, do you not understand that I have power to crucify you? And Jesus is like, you have no power over me. Again, who is Jesus? What, this is that high Christology that you named early on. That's what exactly that is. And then, then by noon, he goes to the pavement stone and he passes judgment, right? In Matthew, we have that incredible scene where Pilate's wife says, I have nothing to do with this guy, or in a dream. And then Pilate washes his hands, that whole washes his hand thing. None of that's in John, but amazing stuff. And then the Via Dolorosa, which, the pilgrims walk, there's really none of that in John, right? It says he carried his cross by himself and he went to the place of the skull, right? Which is right outside the wall. The place of the skull is simply the quarry where they're taking all the stones to build Jerusalem, and they're just killing people in the quarry. That's what this is. And this, now there was a stone, the place the stone is, there was a stone that looked kind of like a skull. And that's how they get this. And they kill him, right? And when they're back to your violence, they kill him. And when they kill him, we have Jesus on the cross, right? And that's what you're talking about. And we get the Marys, we had some really funny conversation about who were all these Marys before we turned on the camera. And they crucify Jesus. And, I'm going to be brief here and just finish up so you guys can share here. But we have, Jesus handing his mother off. I would like you guys to answer this when we're done, okay? How come we already know she's got other kids? Why does she go to John, the beloved disciple, not her other kids? So we'll all wait for your answer on that. And then we get 3 of the last 7 words. Woman, here is your son. I am thirsty, and it is finished. And 3 of the last 7 words. And then it says that John is he who saw this has testified so that you may believe. So John is saying, I was there. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth. And then we have Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus putting him in the grave. And I just want to claim and notice one more thing. It says that Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes weighing about 100 pounds. Okay, we don't talk about that. We always say that the women brought it the next morning. 100 pounds. They took his body and wrapped it with the spices in linen cloths, according to the burial custom of the Jews, that they had already done that. So that's not the way that story is quite told. So sorry that was long-winded, but,
very helpful
to back that.
Very helpful to actually go through the whole drama. The sweetest moment for me in this gospel. In Mark and Matthew, honestly, the thing which I cling to is, my God, why have you forsaken me? This quotation from the Psalms, this experience of God abandonment had by the Son of God, God being God abandoned. That's what I cling to. But in this gospel, I cling to Jesus giving the care of his mother over to the beloved disciple. Jesus is concerned about what's going to happen to his mom when he dies. Yeah. I mean, there's so much that, WWJD, it only goes so far, right? WWJD gets you to my current age, which is 33, my Christ year. I heard somebody say like that. So if I outlive 33, I'm going to have outlived Jesus, right? Jesus just didn't go through a whole lot of stuff, right? Jesus didn't have a 401k because he didn't need it. He only lived until he was 33. Jesus didn't have to deal with elder care issues. He wasn't a caregiver to an aging parent. He didn't, he never got married. He didn't do that, blah, 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 blah. There's lots of stuff that Jesus just didn't live through. And here, though, you still have Jesus sharing a massive concern for so many people today. I mean, I was reading in the New York Times about the crisis in elder care, finding elder care professionals. Anyway, it's just not there. Shocking. And here, he's trying to settle that for his mom before he dies. And I think it's an incredibly human moment, right? Beautiful. I mean, you would think that if Jesus was completely conscious of everything in his human consciousness, if Jesus, qua human being, was completely conscious of everything John is saying is true of Jesus, Jesus would just be like, well, I'm gonna see you again in a couple of days, Mary. It's a very human moment. And perhaps it shows us Jesus didn't, maybe it's a sign that even in the Gospel of John, if this isn't an historical event, maybe Jesus in his human consciousness anyway didn't quite understand everything that was going on here either. The God, my God, why have you forsaken me would certainly suggest that in Mark and Matthew. But anyway.
I can't wait till another year when we get to that line. But that's not for now. But I mean, that and you on that one, I'd like to hear that too. But anyway,
totally.
Keep going.
Why him? Because I think that for Christians, water is thicker than blood. So he is, clearly he's concerned for his biological mother, right? But he gives the care of his biological mother not to one of his biological brothers. And I think that's because I don't think it's just propaganda on John's part, right? John loves the beloved disciple because the beloved disciple is John, et cetera, et cetera. I think I could see it really happening historically because Jesus was close to John. And we're not, we have families, we have spiritual families and we have families of origin. And sometimes those two are coextensive with one another. Sometimes they overlap and sometimes they don't. True. And they didn't in every case in Jesus' life. And this is an example. Yeah. One thing I do hope that, Elizabeth, you're a real expert on this. Before we leave, I feel it would be irresponsible to discuss the Gospel of John, the Passion narrative according to John, without discussing the rhetoric of the Jews in this gospel, which is a topic of much conversation and much debate in the Episcopal Church today. How ought it to be translated? Did the Jews kill Jesus? Answers no, right? Answers no. But the rhetoric here in the Gospel of John is heightened, even higher than it is in Matthew, and in Matthew it's pretty heightened. How do you deal with this rhetoric before we go?
Oh, wow. I was also going to comment on the women.
Go for it. Yeah.
I mean, since you asked, and he's the boss, and I felt like that was it's pop quiz, so.
Yeah, right.
And then I would love to go on to that. But I find that you're both calling this disciple whom Jesus loved John, and that's a possibility that it's this John who wrote the gospel. But, Raymond Brown, you've probably both read his book, The Community of the Beloved Disciple, and it's all about this gospel. And he's not necessarily John of authorship of this gospel. Maybe, and I think that's a, strong scholarly possibility. But there's also the suggestion that this disciple whom Jesus loved is us, everyone who comes after. And in John, the writing of this gospel, the time was this community. The one that Jesus loved is the one who does my will and, follows my path. So and his mother, Mary, the one who gave birth to him, humanity, the humanity I find that could be represented by the mother, that Jesus is handing over the reins of humanity to his disciples and saying, take care, care of this, birth source or whatever, like the mother is you could say the earth, but it's each other, we are each other's mothers and one another's children are our children. And so Jesus handing us care of those who would give birth to more of us, it's just to care for humanity. And Jesus is he's going from their presence physically. And whether he knows or not that he'll resurrect, he knows he'll be in a different state and that his bodily presence, it will be up to them to be the hands and feet of Jesus caring for one another. So that's sort of where I like maybe to go meditating on that. It's gorgeous. It's so important. And there's nothing in John that only has one meaning. So I think if we were to spend the hours and hours we could on this, we could take all these words and find all the double meanings and all the possibilities, because it's all of them together that make this so rich.
I'm really glad you said that, because that may very well turn out to be my Good Friday sermon. That was really good. That's nice. People at home, don't steal that one. I got that one at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Caney, Connecticut.
And to that point, here we go with the Judeans and Jews. So I think John too has double meanings there. So,
how do you make sense of all that? The translations here. Would you translate it Judean instead of Jews?
Well, I think since it's a legitimate translation, yeah. And Pilate, he's head over the Judeans, right? Like he's the governor of Judea, right? So to ask Jesus, are you the king of the Judeans? Is one way to corner Jesus into, are you taking over my territory or something like that? On the other hand, Pilate's like, I'm not a Jew, I'm not one of you. And he's very quick to distance himself. So a threat to Pilate would be the Judeans. Yes, I'm a king of the Judeans. But for Pilate, for Jesus to claim or them to accuse him of being a king of the Israelis or the Jews or the Israelites, it's not really Pilate's domain, the religious people. So I think there are two ways to read that. It becomes anti-Semitic when we pit the Jews against the Christians, and through history, that's what's been wrong with this. Right. So I don't know. I'm not an expert at all. I mean, hardly, but we've talked about that together sometimes. Yeah, absolutely. That's a really important place to, I think, end, because the ambivalent history of Good Friday has been that Good Friday gets caught up in the same violence we've been describing, right? Perpetrated by Christians against Jews. Good Friday historically a terrifying day for Jewish people.
I couldn't agree more. I just want to add my voice to the horror of anti-Semitism and the reading of this in that way, and that the Jewish people and the drama and trauma that they have experienced in their history and are still experiencing. I mean, I don't know if you're following about the most recent story in France, and we have, my sister has great friends who are Jewish who live in France, and to hear their life, I mean, we are living. You want to talk about evidence of a fallen world? This is incredible evidence of a fallen world, where there's nothing redeeming about anti-Semitic violence. There's nothing redeeming about it at all. Amen. And I just have to say that Christians as a whole group of people stand to be condemned for that, but not in particularity. So I'm not condemning all Christians by that, but the body of Christianity, the history of Christianity. That incredible book, James Carroll's book. Can't even remember the title of that book. Where James Carroll, former Catholic priest, wrote a book, Constantine's Sword. I mean, it is a brutal history, and unfortunately, it's also still lived out in too many places. And the interpretation of the Scriptures. The important thing most often is not the Scriptures; it's the interpretation of Scriptures and the misinterpretation of Scriptures. The misinterpretation of Scriptures is the most dangerous thing on the planet. It's the most dangerous thing on the planet when people believe they are God-fueled for this violence that you started the whole podcast with. It is a crime against humanity, and it's a crime against God. It's just terrifyingly terrible.
Yeah, I'm into that. Thank you all for sticking in here for what is probably, I think it would be the longest Rev'd Up for Sunday, Rev'd Up for Thursday, a special edition on Good Friday. Just to say that, especially where our conversation has ended, may the mystery of Good Friday be made real in your heart and in the lives of those whom you love this year. Thank you so much for sticking with us. Like, share, and subscribe. Help us to share God's grace with a world in great need, and God bless you.